We have a very packed schedule of debates today and a lot of issues to discuss, and I don't want to fall behind. So welcome to ChinaPower Up for Debate, which is the inaugural conference of the ChinaPower Project, and I'm Bonnie Glaser. I'm director of the ChinaPower Project and senior advisor for Asia here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The first thing that we do at our events at CSIS is just to give you a short safety message. No reason to be concerned that we have any security threats, but we want you all to know that we think in advance about how to safely evacuate everybody in the event that there is some kind of an incident. And so many of you, of course, came up the stairs right out there. To the right of the bank of elevators, there is another staircase. And then behind me, right past the freight elevator, there is another staircase that takes you outside and in the back. And everybody can convene at the National Geographic, and I'll buy you all hot chocolate. But anyway, we don't expect any incidents today. So I'm going to start just with a short introduction. Hopefully, many of you have already familiarized yourselves with the ChinaPower website. It's chinapower.csis.org. And in our project, we essentially break down Chinese power into 5 categories and try to evaluate trends in Chinese power relative to other countries by asking questions. And so we look at military, social, technological, economic, and international image as the 5 categories of Chinese power. And so if you haven't visited our website, I hope you will. We are trying to bring data and objectivity and understanding to the nature of Chinese power. Because China's rise, of course, is one of the most hotly contested issues in international affairs today. So we are dedicated to providing informed and objective analysis about China to elevate the public discussion about how China is changing. And our website brings data to the study of both Chinese strengths and weaknesses. And of course, this is, I said, is our first conference, and we've decided to structure our conference today around a series of debates on propositions about Chinese power. So today's event, just to give you a brief summary of what today will look like, and you have the agenda in front of you, we will start with 2 leading experts who will frame the issues relating to Chinese power, one from the United States and one from China. And then we will hold 5 debates on key propositions relating to Chinese power. And all of you will play an important role by voting on each proposition. And when we get to the first debate, I will explain how you use the clickers. Some of you may have been to our conferences previously, where in our annual Asia conferences, we have had voting. So each one of you has a clicker, and I will look to all of you to vote and express your views. And then to wrap up the conference, we are very privileged to have Senator Dan Sullivan provide his thoughts on the opportunities and challenges presented to the United States by China's rise. Our conference is being webcast live. It will be archived on the CSIS website for future viewing. And today's conference, as well as the ChinaPower website, are made possible through a generous grant from the Carnegie Corporation, and I'd like to thank them and my staff for supporting our project and for their dedication to our work. So with that, I'm going to start with the first panel and invite up Professor Tom Christensen and Professor Zha Daojiong. And you can both, if you wish, you can speak either from the table or from the podiums, whatever you are most comfortable with. So to my right is Professor Tom Christensen, who is director of the China and the World program at Princeton University. As many of you know, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. And he is going to be giving an American perspective on China, an American, as there are so many of them. And then following Professor Christensen, we will have Professor Zha Daojiong, who is Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University, as well as the Senior Arthur Ross Fellow at the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. You all have detailed bios of both Professor Zha and Professor Christensen, as well as all of the other speakers today. So I won't go into further details. I'll ask both of you to take about 15, 20 minutes and frame the issues that we will be talking about the rest of the day that related to China's rise. So we'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. All right, it's on now. Thank you, Bonnie. It's great to be here. I think the ChinaPower project is terrific. I'm proud to be affiliated with it as an advisor. The website is, if you haven't visited it, please do so. I'm also very grateful to be here with Professor Zha Daojiong, a friend and colleague of many years. Bonnie initially said, we have to debate, and I said, well, I can't really debate with Professor Zha Daojiong, so we got a special dispensation to speak about issues as a framing session instead of debating. Since it is being webcast, I'm obliged to say as an advisor to the State Department that these are my views, not the views of the U.S. government, and I think as I speak today, you'll realize that that's very true, that these are not the views of the U.S. government. I think that China's rise has been a source of both instability and stability in the East Asia region, and I want to talk about the aspects of China's rise that have been destabilizing and the aspects that have been stabilizing. The biggest problem on the instability side has been the sovereignty disputes, particularly the maritime sovereignty disputes, and the rise of Chinese air and naval power at the same time. The problem is really rooted in 5 issues from my perspective. First, there's the expansive claims that overlap with the neighbors, including U.S. allies like Japan and the Philippines. There's the fast-paced growth of China's air and naval capabilities in both the military realm and the civilian realm. This includes civilian law enforcement, Coast Guard, and paramilitary, the maritime militia. And I think those last 2 categories don't get enough attention in the writings about China's rise in the maritime realm. China's assertive behavior in building islands, artificial islands, and making administrative rules that apply to disputed areas has also been destabilizing. And the islands themselves, I think, make President Xi Jinping's promise not to militarize the South China Sea disputes ring hollow for most of the regional actors and for the United States because of the nature of the construction on those islands. China's apparently unwilling to seriously negotiate codes of conduct with the regional actors for both military and non-military vessels, and I want to emphasize that. Those codes of conduct should not just apply to Navy ships and to aircraft, Air Force aircraft. It should apply to those civilian vessels as well. And then finally, and I think this is perhaps most important and maybe relevant for later discussions today, is China's rejection of standard interpretations of international law as it applies to these maritime disputes. Things like drawing of straight baselines in the paracels, which run against the spirit or letter of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This bodes ill for the Spratly Islands in the future, what China may try to do with the Spratly Islands. Interpreting the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to mean that militaries need permission to operate in exclusive economic zones. Rejection of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea ruling in the dispute with the Philippines. All of these raise concern that China is trying to create a functional lake in the South China Sea that would prevent foreign militaries from operating there freely. This would have enormous implications for U.S. alliances in East Asia if the United States was even viewed by others as being excluded from operating in the South China Sea without Chinese permission. So I think this is the main reason that the U.S. Pacific Command has conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea in recent years. Personally, I think those operations should be more regular, maybe more frequent and more regular, and more quiet. But in general, I think they're entirely appropriate for the challenge that the United States and its allies face. China's objections to those freedom of navigation operations underscore the fact that China seems out of step with mainstream interpretations of international law. And I think U.S. Officials and commentators often focus on the wrong thing when they think about the South China Sea and what the U.S. stakes are there. There's a lot of talk about $5 trillion of commercial trade that goes through the South China Sea, and how China shouldn't be allowed to block that trade. I just don't see that as a problem. China wouldn't just be shooting itself in the foot to block the $5 trillion of trade in that region. It would be shooting itself in the head. So I don't think China has any incentive or desire to block commercial trade. The real issue is, will the United States military be able to operate freely there without first having to ask Chinese permission to operate there? And that has huge implications for the U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia and in Southeast Asia, and the incredible web of military power that the United States has developed through contacts through various ports around the world. The South China Sea has to be a place where the United States can operate. The military piece, I think, is serious, and the United States and others need to continually assert their rights to operate militarily in the South China Sea without Chinese permission, again. So the region, I think, would be much more stable if China would do what the U.S. government has asked China to do, which is clarify its claims in a way that are consistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, handle disputes in non-coercive fashion, seek serious confidence-building measures that apply to both civilian and military vessels. And I think China's reluctance to do these things feeds the fear that China is seeking domination of the South China Sea at the expense of others. So that's the real source of instability that I see. I think the U.S. itself can do a lot better on this. I think it's a real shame that the United States bases its foreign policy on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but is unable to ratify it. And I think that the United States needs to be consistent about the behavior of all actors. So in areas like Okinatori, where Japan has a functional artificial island, the United States should call out its allies when those allies are making claims that are beyond the scope of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States should do regularized freedom of navigation operations, not just near Chinese artificial islands, but near the artificial islands of others. And I was encouraged to hear in public reports that that has occurred in the past, and that would be consistent with the international legal basis for the U.S. strategy. And freedom of navigation operations should be quiet. They should not be moments for macho posturing by the U.S. government. Freedom of navigation operations are among the most mild military operations imaginable. And the whole point of them is that they be an assertion of normal practice rather than something dramatic. And I think it's been unfortunate that every time there's a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea, it gets on the front page of the New York Times, and someone talks about either the rebalance or the pivot or some other equally ill-advised phrase for U.S. foreign policy in the region. I think the Nike commercial, "Just do it," should apply here. Just do it regularly. The Chinese will notice. They have the ISR to know we're there. And if our allies don't notice, we can tell them. But I don't think it's constructive or stabilizing to make a big public fuss about our freedom of navigation operations when the whole point is to say this is just normal behavior of a global military. On the economic front, I think China has been much more stabilizing than it gets credit for, and it's been criticized much more than it should be criticized for its economic behavior. And in the investment realm, the development investment realm, I think China has done a lot of constructive things recently and has received too much suspicion about what it's trying to do. I think the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is a positive initiative. It should have been welcomed heartily by the United States at the very beginning. And it's unfortunate that the public diplomacy made it seem like the United States was opposed to the initiative and opposed to American friends and allies joining it. There's a big need for infrastructure in Asia. China is good at building it. China has excess capacity in the financial realm to invest in infrastructure, and it has excess capacity in the infrastructure construction realm, so it has an incentive to do so. My strong belief, and I've learned a lot from Professor Zha on this score, is that China would have invested in these areas in the region regardless of whether there was an AIIB or not. And the fact that there's an AIIB means that China is doing this in concert with others in a multilateral setting, which means there's more transparency in the operations, less corruption, which is very notable because a lot of China's foreign investment in Asia has been full of corruption, which is bad for China and for the regional actors. More focus on solid, profitable projects. If China's out to make money in the AIIB, that, all things being equal, should be a stabilizing factor because it means that the money's not being used to buy off various leaders or create political leverage. It's there to create profit and economic benefit. And I think on that score, it's going to be much more concerning to watch China's One Belt, One Road investments, which are more likely to be bilateral, less likely to be transparent, less likely to have foreigners looking over the shoulder. So I think AIIB was a good thing. Many argue that China is revisionist in creating these alternative institutions to the Asia Development Bank and the World Bank. I don't see it that way, in part because I don't see economics fundamentally as a zero-sum game in the first place, but also because most of the early investments by the bank have been done in conjunction with the major international lending institutions. So the Asia Development Bank, the World Bank, and even the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have been involved in the early AIIB investments. The bank's charter itself, my understanding, was written by a U.S. law firm along fairly standard international lines. China is unlikely to accept some of the Millennium Challenge goals that have been driving the investment strategies of the United States and the Europeans since 2000. But on this score, to call China revisionist, I think, is the wrong way to look at the issue. I think the United States and the Europeans are revising the international lending institutions for good. I actually like these revisions that are being pushed in the Millennium Challenge project. But what China is really doing is trying to hold on to the old rules, where you don't get involved in the governance issues when you invest. That's not revisionist. I would say the U.S. is more revisionist and China is more conservative. That's just maybe a semantic point, but I think it's an important one, because I think on a range of issues where China is considered revisionist in international institutions, what China is trying to do is hold on tightly to the old rules. And the United States and others think we need better rules, whether it be in trade like TPP, whether it be with responsibility to protect at the UN Security Council, or whether it be in the lending realm with the Millennium Challenge goals. So China seems comfortable with the old rules. It seems that it will even accept some administrative conditions as a goal for lending. In other words, when it loans money to some of the Asian countries, it might look for more administrative transparency, but not political improvements along the lines laid out by the United States and the Europeans. I think this basic point about investment applies also to trade. A lot of people are upset, including me, about the failure of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I am upset about it for maybe a different set of reasons than some. One of the common arguments you'll see in newspapers in the last few weeks is that China will create this RCEP alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's not a gold standard for a free trade agreement. Those gold standard agreements like the TPP, like the U.S.-Singapore bilateral trade agreement, include investment, IPR protection, improved labor rights, et cetera, and that's why the TPP was considered an improvement over the traditional agreements. But RCEP doesn't really challenge the international institutions as they currently stand. All they do is have lower standards for international free trade than those more advanced agreements that had been negotiated through the TPP. Trade deals are not zero-sum games by their very nature. All things being equal, they help all international actors in a globalized economy, even those who are not involved in the trade deals. by creating greater wealth and commerce. And I would say that the United States would arguably be best off if both TPP and RCEP were sealed by the U.S. and its negotiating partners and by China and its negotiating partners. That would be the best outcome. The next best outcome would be no TPP and RCEP, because that would be more integration in Asia than we would otherwise have. And the worst outcome would be neither. And that's, again, because I don't see these economic deals as a zero-sum game. I believe the same is true for China, that China would be better off if TPP went through, even if China wasn't involved in it. People are concerned about the great prestige that China will gain by having RCEP without a U.S.-led TPP. I think that's a misnomer, by the way, U.S.-led TPP. I do not. The idea of TPP originally came from 4 non-American actors in APEC, and it occurred because the Doha round had ground to a halt. It occurred during the Bush administration. It is not part of the pivot to Asia. The United States agreed to get on board because the idea was that by creating a high standard, Singapore standard free trade agreement, we would make China jealous. And China's jealousy would lead China to open up its economy further so it could get into the TPP. And that would be good for China, and that would be good for everybody else. It was very far from a zero-sum rivalry in its logic from the beginning. It unfortunately got caught up in that, as I said before, the ill-advised and unfortunate pivot language of the Obama administration. And it started to look like something that was targeted at China, exclusive of China. And I would say the same thing for RCEP. The United States isn't going to be involved in that. But if there's lots of more trade in East Asia, that should be a force for peace. And I think that's, the reason I talk about economics in my talk so much is that I do believe it's the underappreciated source of peace and stability in East Asia is international commerce and investment. And since China joined the WTO, the region has become much more integrated into a transnational production chain. And that has been, I believe, a force for peace. It's hard to prove because it's a non-event. And I think anything that increases that kind of economic integration is not only good for economics, but good for security. And the problems that I see are that China seems to be moving in negative directions on a couple of counts, because I think that same rule applies across the Pacific with the United States and China, that the trade and investment relationships between the United States and China have been major forces for peace in the U.S.-China relationship. They have been a ballast for the U.S.-China relationship. And I'm concerned, given certain trends in China and in the United States, that that ballast might go away. And I think we'll notice in a hurry if it does start to go away. So on the Chinese side and the U.S.-China relationship, I think the treatment of U.S. corporations in China, the demand for technology transfer, the IPR problems, and the closing of the Chinese market in certain sectors to foreign investment are bad not only for the economic relationship between the two countries, but the security relationship. And there's another trend that I haven't studied carefully enough to speak with much authority about, but that I'm concerned about. I mentioned before the transnational production chain, where products are made in multiple countries, assembled often in China, and then sent out to foreign markets. I believe that that's been a major source for stability. My understanding is that China, as part of a concerted effort of its central government, is trying to replace some of the foreign links in that transnational production chain with Chinese suppliers. And to the degree that occurs over time, that network of interdependence that I do believe is a major force for peace could become reduced in its importance. And that's just something to watch. In general, since 2001, since China joined the WTO, which I think was a good thing for the United States, a good thing for China, and a good thing for the region, the transnational production chain has gotten deeper, and it's gotten deeper in a hurry. It's been accelerated. If that trend turns around and goes in another direction, all things being equal, that should be a negative force for peace and stability in East Asia, and it's something to watch. So I'm concerned about some of the most recent trends in economic relations between China and its neighbors and between China and the United States. But in general, I think China's rise in the economic sphere, including in these institutions that it helped found, have been a stabilizing force for the region. and should be appreciated and not criticized in the United States and elsewhere. So I'll end with that, my concerns about instability and stability in the region. I was asked initially to debate like everybody else, and I said I don't even agree with myself half the time, so I don't know if I can play that role. But then when I heard that Professor Zha was going to be here, I knew that I didn't want to get into a debate. I don't know what we disagree on or what we agree on, but I look forward to his comments, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tom. You've raised, of course, many of the issues that we will be digging into throughout the day, and I know that we're going to hear similarly insightful and interesting perspectives from you, Professor Zha, so please go ahead.
Good morning. When Bonnie asked me to join the workshop here, she mentioned that Tom was going to be the speaker. Then I said if Tom was going to be here, I would be here, even though it's just I came here just for the function today. As you know, I'm a Chinese person. I speak English as a second language. So there are great difficulties there. Anything I say should not be held against me or anybody else. I did come up with a 10-page PowerPoint. Basically, let me go through the PowerPoint and in between say a few words in relation to what Tom just said. Of course, this is a time of transition, both in the U.S. and also sometimes you would say in bilateral relationships between China and the United States. One of the major points of difference between our two great countries is over what happens in the region. Sometimes we don't appreciate as much that peace has actually prevailed in the region since the 1970s, more specifically 1975. If you look at what's been going on in the Middle East and elsewhere, this is a big deal. We should cherish that. And what underlines this peace, as Tom just said, is also the cause of friction. That's an East Asian paradigm of growth. China followed the steps of Japan and Korea and the so-called four small tigers in importing raw materials, trying to create full employment at home and export our final products. In that whole process, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan functioned as financier, high-tech, new tech developer, and consumer products of the first resort. So we should never forget that China's growth or China's process is part of the international movement, global movement, of what we sometimes call globalization. I share Tom's point about China not replacing the foreign participation in its economy, not driving out. Actually, one small point to note is that just barely 2 months ago, China finally took the move to join the International Migration Organization. It's a project I myself helped to work on. This is an idea to help, bring foreign talents into China and give them Chinese citizenship, give them a clarity in being part of the Chinese system. So when we look at China as an economic power or economic entity, people usually point to the left side, that is, that shows how many the percentage of countries, economies that depend on China for export, the primary products, immediate products, and final products. We don't have to go into the details. On the right-hand side, people often forget is the inflow of foreign capital into China in those difficult years from the 1990 to the year 2000, before China joined the WTO. So this a little bit of historical contrast help us to understand several things. Number one, the trade flow is by nature transactional. There's no such a thing as one economy that's one-sided dependent on anybody. Those economies that have a high level of dependence on exporting to China, China is just as vulnerable and in need of goodwill. And for us over there in Beijing, in China, we should not forget the Bretton Woods system and also Western ODA. This includes especially Japanese ODA, named yen loans to China, played a very essential enabling role in facilitating the high amount of private flow into China back in those uncertain years of the Chinese economy before the economy took off after China joined the WTO. So in many ways, China's growth record is a validation of the positive value in the post-World War II international economics architecture. We should not try to undo that. And some in China would say that today the Chinese have found a uniquely PRC or uniquely Chinese model of growth. The jury is still out. Many economists, Andy Scheer and others are here, later will debate whether the Chinese slowdown today is cyclical or structural. But when you are cyclical frequently enough, the slowdown becomes structural. Now, as Tom I did not do the notes together with Tom, but we just talked about the same thing. The Belt and Road Initiative. I actually started working on this way before this was called the Belt and Road myself. But in any case, as I see it, the Belt and Road Initiative makes sense because it adds something to the big ideas of how we try to have growth around how we move the world economy forward. The basic instinct is to get some growth in consumption. If you look at and find China's niche in that global growth, if you look at what happened post-2008, we had quantitative easing, we had China's own 4 trillion stimulus. Those things don't work. You need to find growth. Where does the growth come from? This idea is actually borrows from China's own experience. If you think about 40 years ago, the United States, Japan, and Western Europe did not give up on China. China was not a major importer of any sort, but you kept the faith in developing a market, in cultivating China into a potential importer of your products. That worked. And today, the Belt and Road is targeted to do the same. If you look, also, we are quite, if you look at what I said, the niche, it's going to focus on infrastructure. And this also comes from our experience of interacting with the World Bank and the ADB and others. When you go back to look at what projects those loans went to in China, over 50% went to infrastructure in China. And we worked on one of the ways China worked on and became successful, including an endorsement by World Bank, is to increase domestic connectivity, the roads, the telecommunications, and that helped do with the urbanization. Today we have the high-speed rails. So, in other words, it's not really that uniquely Chinese. It's basically learning from how we interact. We learned from how foreign countries interacted with us. We learned from how we try to do poverty reduction at home. Now, what's more important in doing the Belt and Road is not what countries are on, what countries are not on. It's not a Marshall Plan. What's more important is soft infrastructure. This is probably a translation from Chinese. It's basically what Americans would call rule-based approach. I made a quick list, but let me not go over one by one. The key point here is that those projects China gets out to finance, they stand a better chance of success when those projects, specific projects, are made less uniquely PRC or Chinese. These have to go by WTO standards. And between China and many of these economies that were invited or that came forward to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, in many cases, we don't have the bilateral investment treaty or even double taxation treaties. We have to go back to the basics. We have to adopt a New York Convention on Dispute Management and also the Washington Convention on Investor-State Dispute Management Mechanisms. Now, in this context, let me add a few words about the TPP. After hearing Tom touch on this, I thought this was going to be too sensitive to mention coming to Washington. Now, the TPP is not a bad the TPP has many good things therein. And some of the ideas are actually already in practice in China. We borrowed from this. For example, the negative list in investment. What ought to be happening between China and the United States, I thought, the order of business ought to be, number one, the two countries conclude a bilateral investment treaty. Moving from that, between China and the United States, there ought to be a free trade arrangement between the two. And then we go on to do a wider Asia-Pacific free trade arrangement. You may think that I'm crazy. No, I'm not. If you look at the RCEP that's in place, it doesn't quite work, frankly speaking. The RCEP is too weak, too toothless. It does not require the member states to make the kind of sacrifices. It's the sort of opposite of the TPP. The TPP is probably too visionary. And when you look at what's touted out there under APEC, the FTA of the Asia-Pacific, there has not been any real serious study of what exactly is going to be liberalized. So we should stop by talking about these free trade arrangements just by counting who is in and who is out. Instead, we should be looking at what exactly do you want to do? What kind of growth? Who is going to sacrifice? Who is going to be the financier of what resort? Who is going to be the importer? Who is going to be the exporter? And where do you want to create the jobs? Those are the issues. Rather than going out there and say, hey, I have a better deal than you do. Nobody has a better deal. If I may say one sentence that may be politically incorrect in a city like Washington, D.C., is that if you recall, part of the WTO negotiation with China, part of the underlying rationale was that no second Japan. Let's make it a little difficult on the Chinese. Let's treat them a little different, right? Let's demand a little more from China than other developing countries at that stage of time. Did it work? No, it doesn't work. Because whatever rule you put in place, you can never deny the potential of human ingenuity. Economies are going to find ways, the companies, the individuals, to circumscribe whatever rule you put in place. So let's be pragmatic, come down, and okay, I need to move on before Now, we do have some uncertainties in regional security. So over there in China, there is a good deal of awareness that many in the United States believe that China is on the wrong side of history. And that awareness drives a lot of reaction, sometimes overreaction. But you also bear in mind many of our leaders, including the leaders today, the generation of leaders, they grew up in the 50s and 60s, 70s, unlike me, myself, who benefited from being exposed to the United States and other Western spots of culture. So sometimes the reaction does, in my own opinion, it's overdone. But what I see here is that between our two countries and two cultures, or should I say two societies, is that we don't really have a serious commitment to be listening to each other. The Chinese talk to themselves in their own way, and Americans have a set of theories that talk to themselves. But the good news, I would think, is each of our two countries is equipped with a strong propensity for introspection and self-correction. And the bottom line, I would believe, is no matter what arguments we have, no matter what we say in public or private about each other, peaceful competition is possible, as has been the case in the past. Now, Tom mentioned, began with South China Sea and other things, the alliance. What are those salient Chinese sensitivities about the United States' presence in East Asia? I wouldn't think the Chinese have any wishful thinking that the alliance would go away. And actually, the alliance, if you use diplomatic language, is a vestige of history, and we live with it. But there are certain alliance practices, including the ISR on Chinese mainland. Those things are sensitive. But it's difficult for the leadership, for the polity, to highlight that sensitivity because you have domestic questioning why, after that high spending on the military, the Chinese military was not able to keep certain of these ISR operations at arm's length. And of course, if you look at the successive expressions from the United States, what kind of China would support, U.S., these are in documents. America supports a prosperous, peaceful, and stable China, but missing in that list is the word unified China or reunited China, right? So we have some differences. But I would say, let's not overplay the difference. Over there in China, we don't publicly embrace the alliance, but there is no private wishing away of the military dimension. And then I would see that over the past several years on the South China Sea, as I see it, part of the problem is this dichotomy that's projected out there. Somehow, U.S. allies will have to choose between China and the United States. I would think that choice is a forced one. It has not helped, and there are a lot of more things we need to do, we can do in the maritime space, making that more productive. Let me emphasize here that there are two lines we don't like about each other. The United States and the allies, you don't like the 9-dash line. Over there in China, we don't like what's called the first island chain or the second island chain. The Chinese Navy is not built just to sail up and down the Yangtze River either. There's no fundamental difference over the principles of the freedom of navigation. And the United States, as a sovereign entity, it's all up to you to sign or not sign whatever international treaty. We work on that basis. And so, in other words, we need to talk, we need to seriously look at each other in the eye, do the George Bush thing, look at each other in the eye. I would think, looking forward, this is the last slide. At this juncture of time, what's really in short stock is some political fortitude that comes from various domestic sources, rather than just this interaction on a diplomatic front. For China, we need to acknowledge that American and post-1945 Japanese contributions to China's pursuit of power and status has been, by and large, positive. We need to do that in China. We need to do that more. Probably, if I could say something for the United States, you would say peace without freedom is not automatically another form of top poverty that the United States must set out to eradicate. And for Japan, Japan is a major factor in these cross-regional matters, even though I didn't say much about it. Japan needs to acknowledge that memories of history are indeed different. And for that matter, we have the same in China as we face Vietnam and India. Just because someone says comments on your way of doing history does not necessarily mean a threat to you. And last but not least, for these Southeast Asian states, including the Philippines and Singapore, or Singapore and the Philippines, it's to say that the choice is not between any state as any guarantor, real or rhetorical, either in military or economic sense. Southeast Asia is and has to be a linkage point for all. It cannot be a blockage for any outside actor. On that note, thank you very much. I hope I made any sense, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zha. Very refreshing to have not only an American depart from policy, prevailing U.S. policy in his remarks, but also to have a Chinese professor to speak his own mind and perhaps disagree a bit with the prevailing Chinese policy, especially as we come to this juncture of preparing in the United States to inaugurate a new president, and we think about how the U.S.-China relationship might proceed in the future. So we have 10 minutes left in this panel, and I'd like to give all of you the opportunity to ask some questions. So I think what I'll do is collect 3 questions, and I would appreciate it if you would all identify yourselves when you ask your question and make it short so that we can come back and give our presenters enough time to give their responses. So we have microphones coming, and please do wait until the microphones come. So I see Joe Bosco in back.
Joe Bosco, formerly with DOD. Thank you, Tom, for another excellent presentation.
I'm having trouble hearing you. I don't know if it's on.
Okay.
Is it on?
Is that on? Your comments on freedom of navigation operations were well put, particularly your point that they ought to be conducted in a normal manner. 3 of the FONOPs that have been conducted in the last several months all had one characteristic. They were not normal. They were innocent passage, which did not have the ships operating in a typical operating manner. So when you say that they ought to be low-key and also as normal as possible, it seems to me we're sending just the opposite message to China. Innocent passage means we concede the territorial claims of the coastal country. So would you reconcile your recommendation with what the actual practice is?
Okay, I want to correct myself that we actually have until 10:15, so we do have more time than I realize. And Chris Nelson here in front? We'll just take 3 at a time. The microphone is right behind you. No, it's not.
No one understands that, Mike.
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. And now Admiral Blair has kindly made me a fellow for Asia at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So in my old age, I'm getting respectable. This is really, in a sense, for the upcoming discussion with Mike and Dennis. But in listening to you and thinking about Joe's question, are FONs really a diversion from what we really need to be talking about? China says, we're not really against them. We just don't want them stuck up, our nose. And we're saying, don't make them a big deal to do it. What should we be more focused on than FONs? It seems like it sucks up a lot of the air of the debate and diverts us from what we're doing, what we should be doing. Thanks.
Okay, other questions? I apologize that it's difficult to see over the podium. I don't know if there's anybody. Yes. Okay. Over here. Right there.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Tom. Do you believe the modest Republican like you still have the opportunity to serve the Trump administration? What do you expect Trump's policy toward China? Thank you.
I think we could have an entire conference on that question. I don't think we should burden Tom with that, but I'll give him the opportunity to reply if he wishes. So we'll take those 3, and then we'll come back and take some more. You want to start, Tom?
About myself? I came to speak about myself.
FONOPs.
Let me just dismiss the last question first. I'm a lifelong independent. I served in the Bush administration. I was proud to do so. But I don't think I'm a standard bearer of the Republican Party. And like most Americans, I really don't know what President-elect Trump will do when he's in office or whom he will hire. So I'll just leave it at that. The question of the FONOPs, Joe's question, a perceptive question. I don't think it's entirely accurate, what you said. My impression from public reports is that the most recent FONOP that challenged baselines may have had some activity that went beyond innocent passage. That would be appropriate given the reported location of where that occurred, which was outside 12 nautical mile limits of any feature. And then I'll just speak hypothetically about FONOPs of the innocent passage form. It's all I can do in this forum is to speak hypothetically about it. and that is that sometimes it's more difficult than it appears to do something more than an innocent passage action near some of these artificial islands, because those artificial islands are near other rocks. So since the U.S. doesn't take any position on sovereignty of any of these rocks, and since rocks cast 12 nautical mile limits, it becomes more difficult to do things other than just do innocent passage near some of those features. And I'm speaking hypothetically, not talking about any particular location or any particular operation, but I think it's something that international lawyers, I'm not one of them, understand better than I do. I try to rely on them when trying to understand some of the subtleties of U.S. policy. But I think the bigger issue is that these operations are supposed to be showing not just China, but the allies and the rest of the world, that the United States is conducting normal activities, right? So I don't know why there's so much muscle flexing associated with it. It's not designed to be a muscle flexing operation, and it's entirely counterproductive. I personally also think the whole language of U.S. strategy in East Asia, the pivot, the rebalance, was also counterproductive. China will notice if we send more of our forces to the Asia Pacific as opposed to the Middle East. China will notice if we strengthen our alliance relationships with regional actors. China will notice if there's a higher pace of activity in China's general vicinity. And I don't think we need to put labels on it and pretend that it is something that it really is not, because a lot of those trend lines were already in place before the Obama administration took office on the military front. So what does the United States need to do besides FONOPS? Chris Nelson's question. Obviously, I think the United States needs a very strong military position in East Asia. It needs to have strong alliances and security relationships beyond alliances in the region. And I think that despite the fact that China's military has increased in its power considerably, especially since 1999, I do believe the United States can achieve its basic objectives in the region, which is to maintain those relationships and that presence, and to prevent the maritime disputes from being settled violently, which I think is a core national interest of the United States and the regional actors, and to maintain the right of the U.S. military to operate in those regions. And if those are the sets of goals that the United States has for East Asia, I think they're achievable. I don't think they're going to be particularly easy because the Chinese military has grown in power, but I think they're quite achievable. And I think that there's maybe too much concern about the ability of a very powerful United States to achieve those goals.
So, Professor Zha, if the United States were to conduct freedom of navigation operations in a more low-profile way, not announced, would China's view of them and response to them be any different?
I'm not an expert on this. I would think after all these many years, there are three things that needs to be done. One is that we should make a greater effort for what Americans would call customary law, international law. In other words, the United States domestic laws, often the understanding of the U.S. domestic laws often is there is this expectation others understand what you do and follow what you do. That's not a real problem, just we don't really know what your domestic practices are, what your domestic laws are. And sometimes we receive all these visitors, some come armed with, huge files, some came very angrily asking the Chinese why we don't follow international law. The international law we read is probably just the law of the sea. But whereas in the American understanding, and frankly speaking, in the State Department papers on those positions, a lot of that is U.S. domestic law. We don't understand. We need to understand. So what the Americans call customary law. So in other words, Americans often, in reality, you are saying, my domestic law ought to be international law. And China needs to live with that and it needs to be more familiarized with it. So that's the first point. The second point is we need to also there is probably come a time when the United States, rather than just coming to Beijing and say, hey, this is what you do, this is what you not do, or those are the red lines. Why not come tell us exactly how you resolved some of the problems with your neighbors, including resource management, including overflights and what else. And the U.S. has its own history of doing it. If you want others to follow you, you probably, and of course, you know, we face the difficulty of diplomats rotating and, you know, bodies of knowledge get lost. But last but not least, I would think, this is just me as a scholar saying, China's requirement for foreign military vessels to notify the Chinese authorities when you pass through the exclusive economic zone areas, of course, you know, what right there you have the problem whether or not you recognize that legitimate claim of exclusive economic zone or EEZ. Probably on the Chinese side, we need to clarify what exactly it meant by prior notification, make it very transparent. And then we also, there can be space for discussion down the road of changing our domestic legislation to be bringing that more in line with most of the practices of, because if you look at this requirement of prior notification just by the letter in the law of the sea, international law of the sea, it's there. But worldwide, there are only some 30 countries require that. Most don't. Probably over there in China, we should think about how we do this a little different. But the end of the bottom line is probably we need more of a serious level of goodwill rather than just a bit of lecturing and pounding and shaming.
Actually, China's position goes beyond prior notification to prior permission, which
right?
is, even so a country like Vietnam requires prior notification. So there are different practices by different countries.
Maybe there is a wrong translation of the law of the sea into Chinese.
I haven't checked the Chinese version of the law of the sea. That's right. You could correct that. We're going to take another round of questions. Okay, over here. And there's a mic coming right behind you.
Thank you. Humphrey Hawksley. I'm a correspondent and author. For both the panelists, a couple of days ago, the National Institute of the South China Sea issued a report warning America against the freedom of navigation operations and saying that it might be prompted to set up an air defense identification zone. Could you tell us, or tell me, what that institute is, who it represents, and what the ramifications of that report are?
Yeah, the standard stuff.
Okay, next question. Okay, the woman right here. And there's a microphone right behind you.
Thank you. I'm Ketin Zhang from MIT's Political Science Department. And thank you both Professor Christensen and Professor Zha for these wonderful speeches. So my question is actually for Professor Zha. So as Professor Christensen mentions the growing trend of Chinese reduced reliance on the global supply chain, I guess I was wondering, as the Chinese economy transitions more into domestic consumption-oriented economy, and as China is less vulnerable or reliant on those high-end intermediary products from Japan, the United States, et cetera, is it going to make China more assertive in the security realm, for example, in the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, given that China is less vulnerable in the economic realm? Thank you.
What's the question?
It says the transnational production chain, if it's actually reducing in importance to China, will that make China more assertive?
And maybe one more question. Okay, right here in the front, on the right.
Hello, my name is Ben I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So my question is about values. The Atlantic actually ran a cover piece titled,
Yeah, stand up so that our speakers can see you. Thank you so much.
So my name is
All
Ben.
right.
I'm from the Carnegie Endowment. So the Atlantic ran a cover piece titled "The Great Leap Backward," And the basic argument was China has grown much more repressive at home and more assertive abroad. So I think this comes down to the fact that U.S. and China hold fundamental disagreements when it comes to values such as human rights, democracy. Do you think the U.S. and China can figure out a way to revise the international system in a way that reflects some of the compromises when it comes to these fundamental disagreements and values? Thank you.
Okay, great. Why don't we let you start this time, Professor Zha?
The ADIZ topic is not new, and the lead scholar of that report has been saying that all the way along. I don't really think there is anything new therein. So it's, let me leave it there. On the question of transnational value chains in China, it's hard to quantify, it's very much like here in the United States. How do you quantify the amount of foreign participation, whether it's too much or too little? I take your question coming from the fact that there is a disappointment in the pace of reform as was promised in the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, especially in terms of market-based reforms on pricing and also reforms to some sectors, monopolistic sectors of the state-owned economy. But I really doubt there is a purposeful or determined effort to drive out foreign participation. We cannot, I don't think that is the case. Does that make China more assertive overseas? Well, that's a matter of perspective. What you see as more assertive, many in China probably will turn around and justify as being necessary self-protection, human rights. Listen, there's no fundamental difference on human rights. China's human rights is not perfect. We don't object to foreign critics' comments on Chinese human rights. We issue a human rights report on the United States as well.
That's good.
Don't we? It's a matter of how you do the human rights. Do you do it as a matter of shaming and stop there? Do you use human rights as a precursor to, let's say, some social engineering, such as in the Yemen or in some part of Egypt? Or you do human rights as before the PNTR decision by President Bill Clinton, linking human rights to terms of trade? So it comes down to the details. That's what I'm trying to say. But across the board, I doubt, are you saying the Chinese rejoice oppressing each other? If that was the case, how could we ever grow?
I wanted to say something on this last thing. I have no problem with China issuing a human rights report about the United States. I remember when I was in the government and someone was upset about the human rights report of the United States. And my view of it is, as long as that human rights report is built on universally recognized norms of human rights and is a sincere effort to criticize the United States for violating those rights, which the United States itself has admitted to violating in various ways in various places, I actually think it's a good thing, because it rejects the argument that there's a kind of Chinese version of human rights and an American version of human rights and a European version of human rights, and it's all based on local culture, which I think is utter nonsense and runs against the very principle of human rights. So if China wants to criticize the United States, we're a big country, we can take it. But it should be based on an acceptance that there's a universal set of norms that China violates all the time. And in terms of the Great Leap Backward, I think it's extremely unfortunate that the Chinese state seems to be extremely mistrustful toward its own people in a way that has intensified in recent years. I think it's unfortunate that the Chinese leadership mistrust each other to such a degree that so many of the people that I dealt with when I was in the government as counterparts are now in jail. And I think that it's very difficult for foreign countries to take seriously the entreaties of Chinese diplomats saying the basic problem in our relationship is mistrust. When the Chinese government doesn't trust its own people and the Chinese leaders don't trust each other, how is it expected that foreign governments are going to have a high degree of trust towards the current counterparts with whom they're interacting? And it's an unfortunate it's an unfortunate byproduct of a flawed system in China. When Americans criticize that system, I don't think they should take the position that this is some kind of, again, zero-sum game between the two countries. The United States wants stability in China, and that's something that we should always infuse into all of these discussions. There's no office in the State Department for a failed Chinese state. There's no office in the Pentagon for a failed Chinese state. A failed Chinese state and collapse and chaos in China would be a disaster of the first order in U.S. foreign policy and international security. But it is a belief in the United States, and it's a belief fairly widespread in China. And I can remember it was voiced much more assertively 5, 6 years ago in China in my conversations, that the Chinese system requires fundamental political reform to maintain stability over the long run, given the increasing complexity of Chinese society. So if you go into the discussion by saying stability is the goal, we're not trying to roll a Trojan horse into China and have systemic collapse and societal collapse. And we believe that in order to get that, you're going to have to give more voice to people, treat the people with more trust, and have more formal legal processes by which you can judge the performance of the leadership rather than party-driven purges based on corruption, then I think the discussion can go forward in a respectful fashion that is not, again, zero-sum in nature. And that's what I would hope the future dialogues with China on these issues would look like. U.S. is very good at wagging its finger in a preachy way. That's unnecessary in those conversations. And one of the things the U.S. can do in those conversations, and has done in the past in my experience, is to actually, frankly, recognize where the United States has violated the international norms of human rights itself, from slavery to Abu Ghraib. And I think we're a strong enough country to do that, and then to engage the Chinese about the problems that we see in China as well.
All right, I want to thank you both for helping to frame a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. I think we've had a lot of commonality between our first two speakers. My guess is that as we move forward in the day to debating our propositions, that we will see some difference in perspectives. So we're going to take a break. Please be back in your seats at 10:30 so that we can start our first debate on time. And please join me in thanking Professor Tom Christensen and Zha Daojiong.